Chapter 9, Byzantium, Early Byzantine, Part 2. We're heading over to Ravenna, as this map indicates with the red arrow. Now, Ravenna is a really interesting location for this empire. Now, we are talking about the Byzantine Empire, which is the Eastern Roman Empire. And Ravenna is more into the western side. And what this represents is a seat of Byzantine control in Italy. So it's a really important port city that you can see on this map. And some even considered it an extension of Constantinople. It was a place that became a showcase of Byzantine art, a way to glorify Justinian, a way to glorify the power of the empire. Some considered it a sacred fortress of Byzantium. And it was, as you can see in this map, on the western side of the empire, but it was a kind of a symbol of the power of the emperor on this western region, in this western section. And this is a powerful church in Ravenna, and this is San Vitale that you're looking at. It was named after Saint Vitalis, as you can see the name on the screen, who was a Roman slave and a Christian martyr of the 4th century. And he was actually considered the patron saint of Ravenna, and so this is dedicated to him. Now I just want you to notice the exterior, very plain, undecorated. Certainly the plan itself, we call it kind of a pulsating, energetic plan. It's not a basilica plan, more of a central plan. You've got the octagonal shape. We're not going to talk as much about the plan, but I just want you to see that the power of this, of course, is in the format and how it's created. But we want to go inside. But let's take another kind of ground view of the church before we walk in. There it is, another view of the exterior. You see again, plain, undecorated, right? Do you remember what we said about why they did that? All right, so think about that. Now let's move in. There you have it, the interior of San Vitale. Look at the decorations all over the place. I mean, you guys, everywhere, on the ground, on the walls, on the columns, on the capitals, above them. Mosaics up even higher up in the more elevated regions of the interior. Everything is decorated. So why do they do that? Alright, so the same reasons we mentioned with early Christian art are also applicable here. We talked about the idea of leaving an earthly space, walking into a heavenly space. We talked about the exterior of the Christian being humble and plain and unadorned, whereas the interior, the heart and the soul, is what's more important and more value is placed on that, right? So you want to think about how that experience of kind of encountering this very plain structure and then walking right into it and being transformed. So your inner soul is transformed, but you're also transferred to a heavenly space. That same idea is applicable here with the Byzantine art as well. So you already saw this view, but I want to just in this case focus in on that you're standing sort of behind the altar and looking in a single direction, right, straight ahead. Now in the next slide I'm going to switch the angle and you're going to be standing on the opposite end looking towards the altar. And this is what it looks like. Of course, the slide has a little bit of a yellowish tint to it, but now you're standing looking towards the altar. And the reason I want you to see this, because I want you to kind of get this shape and the way the walls and the interior is kind of constructed. But look towards the altar and then look straight up. Right there you see a figure of Christ. We're going to zoom in on that. And that's what the figure looks like. That's what the mosaic looks like. So you see that it's right at the top of the apse. So if you're looking at the into the apse at the altar and you look up, right, your eyes kind of veer upward, you would see an image of Christ between angels, a saint, and a bishop. And actually the saint in the far left, that's Saint Vitalis, who is the patron saint of Ravenna. Now the reason I want you to see this in context is because the red arrows are actually pointing to the next two mosaics that are on your info sheet. One will be Justinian and one will be Theodora, the empress. See, on the left is Justinian, on the right will be Theodora. And those are the ones we're going to focus on a little bit more. But I wanted you to see the context of it because here's the thing. Jesus is dressed in a purple robe. We've talked about purple before as being a royal color. And just kind of as a quick aside here, kind of a quick side note, the purple dye came from a very special shell, and that was very, very expensive. That's why it was reserved only for royalty. And in fact, we're told that there was an emperor at one point who made it against the law for anyone but himself to be the one wearing purple. Okay, so that's why the purple is an important focus. So what you want to think about now is there is Jesus in the purple, in the royal colors. And so you will also see Justinian and the Empress in similar colors, kind of making it a nice connection in that apse. Alright, so this is the mosaic that's found in that apse, right below the mosaic of Jesus with the saints and the angels. So you have Justinian in the center. He is supposed to be wearing purple. Now you guys, I know it doesn't look like purple in the slides because it looks a little darker, but it is supposed to be purple. So there you have him. He is in the center, and it's almost like this impression of like Jesus and his disciples, right? Kind of like the most important figure in the center, and all kinds of attendants and others nearby. So who does he have in this mosaic with him? Well, we have the imperial guard bearing the inscription for Jesus. Then we have his staff, and then of course he's in the middle. And then Julius the banker. Now, Julius the banker is the church's benefactor. He was a very wealthy citizen. Apparently, he provided 26,000 solidi, which is equivalent to about, let's say, 350 pounds of gold coins. Like, that's how much they would be weighing. And so it's thanks to him, right, like he financially backed the church so it could be actually constructed. And then we have Bishop Maximianus. Now he's so important that his name is actually inscribed right above his head. And he is the one that's responsible for San Vitale being completed. So he was the one who made sure that the building was completed, the mosaics were done, and it was thanks to him that the church is actually, was alive and well and thriving. And then next to him are a couple of clergy members. Okay, so you've got the emperor. So you're seeing both the imperial presence as well as a religious presence, right? As well as a patron, of course. So kind of the financial component there as well. Now, what are they doing? They're looking straight out at us, right? I mean, Justinian himself engages us very directly. Now, he's also holding something in his hands, right? He's holding a vessel. We're going to see the relevance of that vessel in just a second, but I don't want to kind of gloss over it. So it's kind of this lavish gold big vessel in his hands. Now that's going to be relevant when we look at Theodora to see what she's holding on the other side. But before we get there, I want to talk about one thing here. This idea of pictorial fiction or a proxy. Now, this is important. Justinian had never visited the church in Ravenna. Okay, he's never been here. However, his presence is felt, his presence is created through this mosaic. What we call that is pictorial fiction, right? It's not true, but the picture, the image creates it, right? So it's kind of like writing a story, making it up. So the image allows us to think that Justinian has visited the church, or moreover, that he is present in the church. Okay. Now this is important. One of the words we use here also is proxy, which means like a substitute. Okay, so this image is a pictorial fiction. This image acts as a proxy for Justinian, who has never been there. Now it's also important to think about this mosaic because it shows that the emperor was interested in this border zone, right? And he also wanted to assert his imperial power here. So though never having come, his presence is shown through the visual images. His desire to exercise his control is shown through the visual images. What about the style of this mosaic? Well, if you look at the proportions, they're not quite accurate. I mean, they seem a little off. In some cases, some things might be exaggerated, like the hand gestures or, the attributes that they're holding. They're also very unemotional. They're looking straight at us, kind of this rigid frontality. They are standing in kind of a straight line. Now I know, one is behind another, but the way they've been depicted is almost like you can draw a line from one hand on the far left straight across the mosaic to the far right and kind of like go through all of their heads. So there's no real variety to that. However, we do see that some of the faces are individualized, like Julius the banker, Justinian himself, Maximianus, right? So there is some individuality. However, in general, it's kind of this unemotional, rigid, just gestures explaining kind of what's happening. So Justinian holding that vessel, okay, or the guards holding their shield and so on. So kind of this flatness to the work. You can look at the feet. I mean, they don't look like the feet would look if they had been done in classical proportions and it had three-dimensionality and volume and so on. So let's step back again and kind of make sure we know where we are. We saw Jesus on the very top of the apse, and then we've just looked at Justinian on one side. Now we're going to go over to the other side and look at the image with Theodora. This is Theodora and the attendants. Let's talk about Theodora just for a second. She comes from humble origins. We're actually told that she's a daughter of a circus bear trainer. She is also, we're told, an entertainer in her youth, clearly coming from kind of a circus family here. And if we're really going to believe Justinian's historian, who tells us all kinds of stories about the couple, she was also a prostitute apparently in her youth. Just some things to know. However, whatever her background is, we are told that she possessed such an intelligence and a toughness that in many cases she was considered a co-ruler with Justinian. And some even said she was one of the most remarkable women of Middle Ages. She really played a role in some of the decisions her husband took. And one of the civil servants in Constantinople actually says that she was surpassing in intelligence all men who ever lived. So she clearly held her own. What is she doing here? Well, she is with her attendants carrying what seems like maybe a gift. In this case, it's a chalice specifically, and you've got the name on the screen for you. And they're lined up, and it seems that they're outside because we can see an umbrella meant to cover her, kind of keep her from harm from the sun's rays and so on. And then the attendants on the right of the screen are under a canopy. So they're outside, kind of maybe in an atrium and covered up. To the left, you'll also see a fountain. And then one of the attendants is actually opening, right, the doorway, kind of pushing aside the curtains there and allowing them, or kind of almost like inviting Theodora and her attendants to be able to walk in. So what are they going to walk into, right? What are they doing? Well, it looks like she's bringing something. She's bringing a gift. And her gown really helps us maybe understand that. If you look carefully and kind of on the enlarged section, the gown, kind of this border of her outfit that she has on, are the three magi, and they're actually bringing gifts to the baby newborn Jesus. And so in a way, with the inclusion of these magi on her garment, it may be equating her with the company of other monarchs bringing gifts to Christ, which apparently is what she is doing in this mosaic. Let's bring it all together with this slide one more time. It's creating a visual and symbolic parallel. So what does that mean? Well, first of all, kind of look at this visual parallel. Christ in purple in the top of the apse, and then on either side, both royal representatives in purple as well. So Justinian dressed in purple, Theodora dressed in purple. So look at this kind of triangle that would be created. So as a viewer, when you're looking at the altar and the Eucharist, the liturgy is taking place, and you look up and look to the sides, you can see this parallel in the images. Why else is it important? Well, we mentioned it before. These are pictorial fictions. They're creating the idea that the emperor and the empress have been to Ravenna, have been to this church, when in fact they had not. So their presence is implicated because of their mosaics. What else is happening? Well, look at what Justinian is holding. He's holding that vessel. Look at what Theodora is holding. She's holding the chalice. Well, those are the objects, those are the gifts that they're bringing to the Eucharist, because one will hold the wine that represents the blood, and the other will hold the bread that represents the body of Jesus Christ. And so once again, that fiction is created that they are there in the church, continually taking part in the liturgy, continually present with the other worshipers, continually asserting their power and their role as the imperial forces of the Byzantine Empire. We take our focus from mosaics on a grand scale in a church to small examples of pictorial art, and we're looking at a manuscript painting in this case. You're actually looking at the oldest, well-preserved painted manuscript that contains biblical scenes. It is absolutely stunning that it has survived for so long. These tend to be more fragile and they're kind of on a smaller scale. But you're looking at what manuscripts generally contain, which is both text and image. And it's up to the writers and the decorators how they kind of juxtapose those two. Text on top, image on the bottom. They might be intermixed with one another. In some cases, one side of the book has an image, the other side has a text. Kind of a variety of cases here. But you're looking at the story of Rebecca and Eliezer, and some will say Eliezer, and both of those pronunciations are fine. So what is the story here? Well, Isaac is Abraham's son, and when Isaac becomes about 40 years old, his parents are thinking it's time to get married. Well, they need to find the right wife for him. What they do is they send their servant Eliezer to get a wife, to find a wife for Isaac. Well, the servant's got to know, okay, how am I going to figure this out? You know, they want somebody from a specific area, a specific family. I don't know what I'm going to do. So he actually prays, and I want to read you his prayer. He says, "O Lord, God of my master Abraham, give me success today and show kindness to my master Abraham. See, I am standing beside the spring, and the daughters of the townspeople are coming out to draw water. May it be that when I say to a girl, 'Please let down your jar that I may have a drink,' and she says, 'Drink, and I'll water your mules too,' let her be the one you have chosen for your servant Isaac. By this I will know that you have shown kindness to my master." So he's basically saying, give me a sign to identify the woman that you have chosen for my master's son, for Isaac. Well, it turns out Rebecca is the one, because she agrees to feed him, or to give him water, as well as the animals that are with him. So there you have it. He has now found the chosen wife for Isaac. I wanted to point out two important sections of this manuscript. First of all, the city of Nahor, which is where Rebecca lives, and she's kind of walking down the Roman colonnade, right, to get to the well to draw the water. And you can see that Nahor is represented kind of in an aerial perspective, a slightly aerial perspective, so you're kind of a bird's eye view, so you can see the city kind of behind the fortified walls. And then as Rebecca's walking, that female figure kind of semi-nude with kind of the blue drapery there, it's a little strange. I mean, we're looking at a biblical scene. It's not a character that's mentioned in the biblical account. It's certainly not Rebecca. And so who is she? Well, she's a personification of spring. Now, guys, what we're seeing here is a biblical story created during the Byzantine Empire. However, we have this classical reference, right? This idea of representing the personifications of ideas and concepts. You've seen that with the personification of valor or courage or, imperial virtues and other things like that. Victory, right? So in this case, it's a personification of spring. And by spring, we mean kind of running water, not the season spring. So I just want to kind of clarify that before we move on. In this section, let's talk about icons and icon painting. So what is an icon? Well, it comes from the Greek word icon, the first bullet on the screen, meaning image or representation. And the word iconography, which we have used countless times this semester, means the language by which an image tells its story. Because icon means image and graphy means writing, right? So the writing or the telling of these stories, of these representations. Now, the principal subjects of icon paintings were Christ, the enthroned Madonna, or saints, and sometimes obviously a combination of these. What about the purpose or the function? Well, icons are objects of personal and public veneration. So they functioned as what we would call living images to instruct and inspire the worshiper. I mean, that was their general task, that was their general purpose. However, they were also considered a medium for what we call kind of a spiritual transaction with the holy figures. Primarily the Eastern Christians, they believed that the icons were a personal, kind of intimate, necessary means and medium to have that spiritual transaction, kind of that what others call a telecommunication device between the faithful and the divine. It was that like the thing that made it possible. Okay? Now, what starts to happen then is that people began to believe that the actual figure was residing in that image. And so they thought that now the icon can intercede on behalf of the faithful, because they believed the icon of Jesus or the icon of Mary, that itself became the intercessor practically. It became the way that the desires of the faithful and the worshiper could be presented, could be given to the divine. I mean, it's a pretty strong connection that's made to icons. They also began to believe that these icons had miraculous healing powers. I mean, to the point, you guys, that they would be burning incense from them, or kneeling in front of the icon, or eating from the icon because they felt it would help with digestive issues and other things. Okay? Now, the settings of these icons, where were they? Well, public and private spaces. In the public space, we find them often in church buildings, and they would light a candle in front of it, they would burn the incense, all of this as part of the divine liturgy. In private spaces, they were in people's homes, and different kinds of rituals would also take place. Oftentimes, we're told people would have what we call kind of an icon corner, and the visitors, when they entered the building or the house of the host, they'd kind of greet the icons as well. Okay, almost giving them a person, right? I mean, that the person was actually residing in that image. Now, something else about icons that's important for us to consider is what we call the gaze. It's that eye. It's that connection between what's represented and the viewer. Now, what was believed was that gaze, that connection, activated the image, animated it. Or this, another way to say that is that there was a visual dialogue between the subject and the worshiper, and that occurred through the gaze. Here's another rare example of an icon. Many of them have not survived, and we'll talk about why. But here's one: Christ blessing. Here is another icon. This is from your info sheet. Virgin, Theotokos, and Child, between Saints Theodore and George. So, let's look at the Virgin first. She's represented in her role as Theotokos. And Theotokos means God bearer, or God carrier, or she who bore God. And the most typical representation of her in images in her role as Theotokos is to show her as, the mother carrying the Christ child, as you see in this image. So Jesus is a little baby, kind of resting in her arms. She's carrying the Christ child. And this title was actually assigned to the Virgin Mary kind of by the early church. And this is one of the councils they held in Ephesus in 43 AD, where they decided of this role of Theotokos. Who else is there? Well, on either side of her, we have Saints Theodore and George. They are considered warrior saints. They are defenders of the faith. They stand there very frontal, looking directly at the viewer. They become our means of kind of accessing the painting. They look at us. They're intervening with the Virgin on our behalf. Okay, a kind of strong vertical form, arms in front, holding their various attributes. They're the defenders of the faith. And then behind them, we have angels looking up. Right, looking up, taking our view to the heavens, where the rewards of the Christian life are found, right, and kind of the typical representation of angels found in many, obviously, religious paintings. Now, the work itself, Mary herself, but especially the warrior saints Theodore and John and George. They are the intercessors. They're interceding on our behalf. Okay. Now, how about if we look at their expressions? What else can we see? Well, they're very straightforward. Mary and the Christ child kind of look away, but they're very approachable, right? The faces are tender, they're accessible, they're humanized, and in many ways, right, they kind of create this connection with the viewer. But the warrior saints, when they look up, right, their gaze interacts with our gaze, and that action right there animates and activates and charges this icon. It creates that devotional experience when we as a viewer are responding to this object. I want to just give you this just kind of to see what's coming up. I mentioned in the Byzantine that Mary's role as Theotokos is quite often emphasized, right? The bearer of God, she who bore God. In the Romanesque, we will see her role as a throne of wisdom because Jesus symbolizes wisdom and she is his throne. Notice it's not like she's carrying a little baby, but she's kind of become the throne for Jesus as the embodiment of wisdom. And then in the Gothic, Mary's often represented as the Queen of Heaven. So she's royalty. She is enthroned. She's got her crown on. It's all about kind of the royal nature of the Queen of Heaven, of Virgin Mary. Iconoclasm, 726 to 843. Now we have a debate about this use of icons. Okay, so iconoclasts are the breakers of images. They felt that any kind of icon was going against the biblical kind of message that you could not worship images that were made by human hands. So they felt that this was leading to idolatry because now you're worshiping the image instead of what the image represented. On the other side of the debate were the iconophiles. These are the lovers of images. They favor them. They thought, no, we're not worshiping the image, we're worshiping what the image represents, and there's nothing wrong with that. So what I want to get into in the next few slides is kind of a set of reasons. Internal reasons for iconoclasm, external reasons for iconoclasm, and then once those images are destroyed, what then comes to take the place? And we'll look at a couple of symbolic forms. Let's look at the internal reasons for iconoclasm, okay, the destruction of these images. Number one, fear of idolatry. They believed that icon veneration would be confused with idol worship. I mean, there were so many pagan temples and statues still around that they thought, well, these could be confused with pagan practices. And you cannot worship an image that's made by human hands. Okay, it doesn't deserve veneration. It's not a relic. It's not a special piece of the saint himself for it to be worshipped, but it's just made by human hands. So there was a fear of idolatry. Number two, unstable rule of emperors. By the end of the 7th and early 8th centuries, the role of the emperor and his power had decreased. And we know this in some of the evidence that we have from these eras, that the power was going more towards the church and away from secular government. And emperors such as Leo III and his son, they wanted to reset that balance of power and reclaim authority. And it's actually Leo III who enacts a ban against picturing the divine. He does that in 726, and that initiates the era of iconoclasm and the destruction of all kinds of images. Number three, a plague and a war at the time had caused a reduction in the population, and many people thought it was because of this idol worship, because of this over excessive veneration and worshiping of icons. Number four, there was also a volcanic eruption on the Aegean island of Tyre, and that was right around or a little bit before 726. Well, the way they interpreted that was this was because of the sins of the empire. And one of those sins was what was becoming what they thought idol worship of icons. Number five, The proliferation of images. I mean, images had grown so much in number that people were wearing icons, and the respect for them had been lost. I mean, they're wearing it, they're eating off of them to cure indigestion, as I mentioned earlier. It was just out of control. I mean, people were using it for everything. So this kind of disrespect, this lack of reverence for it had become really excessive because of the proliferation of images. And finally, the sixth reason, internal reason for iconoclasm, is the nature of Christ. So, was he man? Was he God? If he was both, is it possible to create an image? Some of the questions they would have asked: if he's not a man, how can we represent him as a man? Right? So why need an icon? Or another way of asking is, if he's a god, why should his likeness be captured in paint? Now, for the iconophiles, these are the ones that loved images, they thought that if you reject an iconic likeness, that's coming close to denying Christ's humanity and his suffering. So you can see that the debates were real, and people on either side were very passionate about the side that they held on to. So when the icons are destroyed, then what forms are used to represent their faith? Well, this is when symbolic forms become really prominent. So things like the cross, a vacant throne of heaven, a cabinet with scriptural scrolls, and then decorative details, so floral, animal, architectural motifs. Here's just an example of an iconoclastic decoration at the Hagia Sophia in Constantinople, and you can see the cross is one of those figures that has come into play quite frequently. Alright, so you're looking at the apse of the Hagia Irene or Saint Irene's church. Now, what you see is a really bare apse. Okay, so nothing is really left here except for the cross. So the cross becomes a powerful symbolic form and symbolic reference during iconoclasm. Also, the church building itself, they did not destroy churches because those were the houses of God. So the church building itself is another symbol. And then what would have taken place here, but that you cannot see in this photograph, is the Eucharist. Okay, so that would be another powerful symbol of their faith. And those took prominence during iconoclasm. And that wraps up our early Byzantine section. We talked about Justinian, his architectural accomplishments, including the Hagia Sophia. We talked about his presence in Ravenna, even though he and his empress had not ever visited. We talked about manuscript paintings and icon paintings, and of course finished up with iconoclasm, which is what brought an end to the early Byzantine in 726.